couple of seconds before we start. So, good afternoon, or it's not afternoon, it's noon. My name is Michael Nystrom. I work at a company called Trusec. I'm an MVP in setup and deployment, and this session is about deploying Windows to Go outside of Contoso. There's nothing wrong with Contoso, but when you lived in Contoso land for a couple of years, everything seems to work. I do live in Sweden. I do travel a lot. I've been doing Windows deployment since, I don't even remember anymore, but I think it was one of the first versions. I'm that old that I used 8-inch floppies. Anybody used 8-inch? Yeah. Great. We can have a party called the 8-inch floppy party. I do training and consulting, and time to run. So, number one is to cover different use cases, when Windows to Go really works and when it doesn't work. We're going to talk about things like domain joining and workgroups, profiles, activations, remote access, images. How do you create the Windows to Go device? So we start with use cases because I had a customer that was attending some kind of session around Windows to Go, and he or she, doesn't matter, but they turned to me and say, I think we had a case for Windows to Go. And I said, okay, tell me more about it. We have 15 Mac users, okay? And they need access to Outlook once a week, okay? So we think they can have Windows to Go devices, so whenever they need to read an email, they just plug in a Windows to Go device and reboot the Macintosh. That's not a good case. There are so many other ways of fixing that problem without using Windows to Go. But they listen to the fact that it's possible to run a Mac on a Windows to Go stick. It is possible to run it, it's not supported, it will never be supported. But there are reasons. Here are some of them. I like the sales guy or the very important consultant. He's sitting over there, extremely important consultant. He needs to have an extra computer, but the company he works for cannot provide it for him. It's too bad, right? But they could provide a Windows to Go device. So you can buy a new computer on an expense reports when you're traveling. An expensive computer. And that works. So here's your Windows to Go device and here's your computer. If the computer breaks, run it on this. It will work. We also have we are multiple teachers that is supposed to share computers. Anybody done we are multiple users and supposed to share a bunch of computers and we need roaming profiles and it should work? Anybody done that? Was it funny? Not even close. On the XP time frame was like, ugh. Windows to Go works in that scenario. Here's a Windows to Go stick, here's your device. So we've done it for teachers in schools. They are back in the small office working, and then they need to go out to the classroom instead of having multiple logons. And even if they do have, because they have separate networks, right? This is the teacher network, and this is the student network. And here's the Windows to Go device. So now the teacher can go to any machine, plug it in, boot up, and have access to the information they have back in the secret network. My kids also wanted the Windows to Go, and I asked them why, and I say, it's perfect, then we can install all the games, and then you have like a portable Xbox. No, that's not a good scenario either. There are licensing rules around this. And they are kind of interesting to read. I do read them from time to time, just because it's so funny to see how they change things without notifying anyone at all. So what happens here is that Windows to Go works like this. If you have a computer that is falling under the software assurance subscription thing, then you're allowed to create 2 Windows to Go devices per machine. That's nice. And you can use them in the same computer. That's also nice. But you cannot use a Windows to Go device on a machine that is not covered by the software assurance license. And it's like, what? How do I use it back home? That's another story, because outside the office, it's okay. It's just inside the office, every machine needs to have the software assurance. So this room is my home now, and it works over here. Now, if you need to have more devices, you can buy something called a companion device license for an extra cost, and then you can have up to 5 USB devices per software assurance license, but it's going to cost you extra. So what I'm trying to tell you is that you really need to read through all these documentation about licensing. It's not obvious. It doesn't work in any situation. It really needs to follow the licensing rules. Otherwise, you're going to be in problem. Windows to Go doesn't need to be domain joined. It works in a work group until it needs an activation. It needs to be activated. It also needs policies to be controlled. So there's a lot of things that happens around this, otherwise it's not going to work. We need policies for the Windows to Go devices to make sure they are in a separate location in Active Directory. Why? Well, because number one, you gave the USB stick or device to one of your sales guy, and he hasn't been using that since he got it. The normal cleaning up in Active Directory doesn't apply. You cannot be sure these devices are in use or not in use, so you really need to put them in a separate location. Most likely, you also want to have separate policies for them. Policies like BitLocker policies. Policies like roaming profiles and things like that. To be able to domain join a Windows to Go device, you more or less need direct access, because the machine really needs to be able to access the network. Can't you do that with a VPN client? Yeah, in some cases you can, in some cases it's going to be hard. But it really needs access to a KMS server, because you cannot use Mac activation. For every time you put in a USB device in a new computer, it's a new computer. The activation process kicks in and say, you know, I need to be activated. So you could hand over 500 Mac keys to every user and say, here you have a bunch of Mac keys. I think that's a bad idea to do. So I prefer to use KMS. Now to make KMS work, you need to expose the DNS. And if you try to expose the DNS externally on your network, you're going to get a phone call from someone at Microsoft saying, you're doing something bad. Stop. So you can't do that. That's why the machine really needs access to the internal network. Of course, the user also needs access to resources. Having Windows to Go and nothing to connect to doesn't really make any sense. And that is also why this is a software assurance benefit from the beginning. There are a couple of ways to join the machine into the domain. You can either do an online, or with Windows Server 2012, Windows 8, you can do an off-site domain join. An off-site domain join is pretty smart. The USB device, the USB stick, is from the beginning actually joined into the domain. The difference is that the new off-site domain join also includes policies. So you can shoot in the certificates that is supposed to be used and all the group policies that needs to be applied for the direct access to work. So here's all the policies, and here's all the information that machine needs, and here's the text file that we uses to make the machine a member of the domain. However, there's a small glitch, just a tiny one. When the user needs to log on, they can't use cached credentials because they haven't logged on so far. So the user gets the stick, it's joined into the domain, everything is perfectly fine, everything is going to work. He takes the stick, he flies to Alaska. Alaska is away from here, it's very cold. He's sitting next to a polar bear and he tries to log on for the first time, but he can't because he hasn't logged on to that USB device before. So before you hand over the USB device to anyone, force them to use it on premises before they leave. Otherwise, they have no cached credentials at all. And that means that if you do have group policies that modifies cached credentials, that is another reason to put these machines in a separate OU. Otherwise, the cached credential function may not work because you configure it not to work, but you really need to have that. The command to join a machine into a domain with the offline domain join or offsite domain join is like this. You do djoin provision, specify the domain name, and you save that to a file. And then you specify the name of the computer. You also specify the location in Active Directory where the machine should show up in. And in this case, I also say throw in the certificates and apply the following group policy. Now, I'm talking about one way of doing Windows to Go. I didn't mention the other way around. So I'm going to stop right now and explain that is actually two ways of doing this. There is something called total chaos and total control. That is a term we use for driver management. The same rule applies for Windows to Go. The total chaos model means that we create one nice image together with one nice unattended XML file with no name in these files at all. It's a random name. And then we send that to a manufacturing plant, and we let them create 4,000 USB devices. And then we go back home, and then we throw it out to everyone that needs a Windows to Go device. But that way you don't know who's got one. You don't know the name of the device. You don't know where in Active Directory it shows up, and you can't link it to any users. I don't like that approach. I don't think it works. So I'm not going to cover that scenario. So this is the scenario when you have control. Each and every device has a unique name, and you decided what name it should have. And all these names of all these machines will show up in Active Directory, and you can then assign them to particular users. So the same way you hand over a computer to an end user, you're now going to hand over a USB device to that user and say, here's your computer, it's just very small. It also needs another computer to work, but treat it as a computer and it will work. To load up the file, we use djoin request object data load file, and then we point to the file. This is the command we run when we have mounted the Vim file. So here is the image, and I want to create the USB device. So I'm going to shoot this command into the file. Now, another problem we have is this is the first time we did it, we didn't realize this would be a problem. Anybody still using roaming profiles? Yeah. My document redirections? Yeah. And it's fine. I try to avoid doing the roaming profiles nowadays, but my document redirection is fine. So we did this for a customer, and they did use my document redirection. I handed over a USB device to one of the end users and said, now try to log on. And she did. And after 45 minutes, the USB stick was full. Well, if you have 2.5 gig in your My Document Redirection folder, it doesn't really fit on a 32 gig stick. But it takes a while before it realizes it doesn't work. So roaming profile and My Document Redirection is not always a good thing. But this totally depends on the customer. Maybe they don't have any documents. Maybe they're using, I don't know, SkyDrive or SkyDrive Pro, or everything is in Office 365 or whatever it's called, the cloudy thingy. So how do you fix that? Well, it's not that hard. There is a new feature. I love new features. But before we do that, Active Directory users and computers. Yeah, I know there's a new administrative center, blah, blah, blah. So here you can see I have a bunch of OUs. I'm just going to fire up something that makes it easier for you to see, even if those who are in the cheap seats in the back. So here you can see the OU infrastructure, and down in the bottom you can see I have a WTJ folder for my Windows to Go devices. It doesn't really matter how this looks like, it's just that you most likely want to have a separate OU for this. And here's the user. Here's the user Bob. Everybody has a Bob. And if we go into the attribute editor for our friend Bob, you're going to see there's a new attribute. And MSDS. There it is. It's something called MSDS primary computer. The attribute MSDS primary computer is a new function that we have in Windows Server 2012. You don't need to upgrade your domain controllers, but you do need to upgrade your schema to Windows Server 2012. The function primary computer means that we can say and define this is your primary computer. And on your primary computer, my document redirection will work perfectly fine. But if you log on to something else, we're going to disable roaming profiles or we're going to disable my document redirections. And to make this happen, you need to specify the MSDS primary computer, which is not that hard. You just find a computer, and here's PC user 08, attribute editor, and I need to find the distinguished name. That's the distinguished name. And I need to go into the user and Bob. MSDS primary computer. And the attribute is called MSDS primary computer, which is incorrect because it should have another name. It should have the name of MSDS primary computers because you can add multiple. So here you define all the machines that roaming profile should work on. Roaming profile should work on. My document redirection should work on, right? If you do have configuration manager in your environment, there is no automatic linking between this attribute and the configuration manager device affinity. You need to run a PowerShell script to combine those into each other. Otherwise, it's going to be out of sync. When that is done, basically half of the configuration is done. You also need to configure other things, especially on either machine level or on user level, folder redirection, redirect folders on primary computers only, and on is it logon? I can't remember. No, it's not logon. Here's just another friendly tip. If you do have Windows 8 in your environment, and you say, we don't need to do any kind of group policies, that's incorrect. This is the only group policy you must do, otherwise you're going to get crazy after a while. This is the group policy that disables the nice animated movie every time a new user logs on. Hi, I can show you some new tricks. If they had, different movies, that would be fine, but this is the same movie all over again. It's like watching the news, just boring. So don't do that. But there's another one. I can't remember the name of it, so let's do a search. Primary. Download roaming profiles on primary computer and redirect folders on primary computers. You can have one or the other. Or, to be really honest, it really depends. Because if you do have roaming profiles, for some reason the redirect folders doesn't get evaluated because you have roaming profiles. So therefore we don't need to do that. The other problem is that this is most likely to be something that you will discover after a while. So now you turn this on. And you hope that all the cached information on all the machines will go away. No, they don't. So you're still going to have My Document redirected folders to all your existing USB sticks and devices. So here's the number one tip from me today. Before you even consider this, if you need My Document redirection folder controlled and even roaming profiles controlled, put up the configuration for configuring this and verify that it works before any user logs on to any kind of Windows to Go device. Otherwise, it's going to take 15 minutes or half an hour or something like that. I'm going to show you later on because it shows up in the event log, so you can search for that event log and see if this is your primary device or not primary device. This can be done either on the user or on the machine. If you want to do PowerShell, that is the command, PowerShell command, to do that. Set AD user, the name, add an MSD primary computer, and then you just use the variables for the PC. So it is pretty easy to configure this. You can have a script running. You can do an orchestrator runbook, for instance. When you add a user, you also define what primary computer that will be, and that both configure primary computer in Active Directory and it also configures primary computer in Configuration Manager at the same time, so you don't need to synchronize. The only issue you have with the primary computer name is that it's the distinguished name, right? What happens if you move a computer in Active Directory to another location? Oh, the distinguished name is changing. We talked about the separate OUs for Windows To Go devices, and we talked about separate policies. We also have these separate management. For Configuration Manager now detects if you do have a Windows To Go device, so it can actually be managed by a Configuration Manager system if you want to do that. The activation, KMS works, but I prefer to use something called Active Directory-based activation. If you do have Windows 8 and you do extend your schema, and you do have one Server 2012, then you can add all the activation keys to Active Directory instead. That means that as soon as the machine starts up and it joins into the domain, it's immediately activated. And if it does need to be activated again, as long as it has access to the domain, it immediately get activated. KMS relies on DNS, and DNS, well, you know, sometimes it doesn't work in the perfect way. Has anybody done the volume activation services in Windows Server 2012, the wizard? Okay, because this is one of the funniest wizards I ever seen. You would assume that you do next, right? Until finish. Most wizards work like that. This doesn't. Because if you do that, you remove the key in the end. In the middle of the wizard, you're supposed to press done, not next, because next means remove the key. I did some feedback about that, and the response from the dev guy was like, oh, so you mean no other wizard works like that? Nope, they don't. But I didn't have time to change it, but I hope it will change later on. The remote access, since it really needs to be activated, you really need to have all this working. Direct access works perfectly fine with domain join. The problem is going to be cached credentials. VPN works, but you need to manage VPN. So I do have customers working both with direct access and VPN, and this is very simple. The direct access customers I have, they never complain about anything at all. The VPN customer I have, let's say we know each other. If you don't have connectivity, Windows To Go really doesn't work at all. It's supposed to be a way to connecting back to the office. Now the problem is the image. Because you're going to do something that is really awkward. I've been doing images for many years, and as far as I can remember, if I go back, my number one thing I always told everyone is, don't put any drivers in the image. And the year is 2013, and now I'm going to say, well, you need to put the drivers in the image. The question is, what drivers should you put in the image? Now, this is the tricky part. Windows has a lot of drivers, so it works on most workstations pretty nicely. It's not going to be the storage drivers at the moment. But you need to put a bunch of drivers in here. Question is, which one? There's two ways of dealing with this. You can either do OEM drivers. That means you discover what you have in your environment and it ends up in, we have HP and Dell machines. So you go to HP and download every driver they have, and you go to Dell and you download every driver they have, and you inject them in the image, and you're going to have a very large image. We don't do that. We use generic drivers. That means we use the OEM's OEM driver. That means I go to NVIDIA, I go to ATI, I go to Intel, I go to Broadcom, and I download their generic, not model-specific drivers. That's the driver I put in. Now, there is only 3 drivers you really need to have: storage, graphic, and network. The other ones, Windows To Go will automatically kick in Windows Update if it has devices it misses drivers from. So when the user pops in the USB device into a machine, he can have the right screen resolution. Keyboard, mouse will work. Direct access work. Network works. He can access the USB stick itself because it also has a driver. The other drivers will be things like AMT or, some keyboard sensor, some fingerprint device. They are not really in use anyway, but it will download that. Now, all these drivers will be remembered and stored on the Windows To Go device. So if the user boots up on the same hardware again, it will be remembered. It actually does a plug-and-play scan. It does another type of plug-and-play scan. The first time you plug in a Windows To Go device in something, it does the normal plug-and-play scan because it's a new computer. The second time, if you have another physical device, it does a minimum plug-and-play device scan. In most cases, this requires a reboot, and this is something you need to educate your users about. They have the device, they plug it in, they are forced to press something in the BIOS to make it boot on the USB device. They see it starts up, it goes like, device detection, blah, 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 50%, 96%, 100%, and then suddenly, reboots. Do you think the user will be prepared to press the same button again to change? Nope. So suddenly it starts up to Windows XP and goes like, hey, didn't I boot Windows 8? So it does require, in many cases, 2 reboots, and that is because driver needs to be initialized, and they can't fix that in one boot at this time. So when it comes to drivers, this is how it looks like. In this case, I use Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. You can use whatever kind of automated tool to create your images, but most likely you would like to have some kind of automated tool to create your image device. Otherwise, it's going to be a pain in the neck to do it manually. The net result you would like to have is a WIM file. So here's a standard reference image sequence, and I'm going to create a new one. The standard client task sequence, and I'm going to pick the Windows 8 Enterprise, and I don't need to specify any keys, and we don't care about a password, and that is done. This means that this deployment share normally has a blank out-of-the-box drivers folder because you don't have any drivers at all in the reference image. This is not the case this time. I do have a folder structure, and I need to import those drivers. Do we have any drivers here? Hup, there you go. If we check all these drivers, do I really need any of those drivers for a Windows to Go device? Nope. This is just a demonstration of how you import the drivers, but those drivers has nothing to do with the graphic, the storage, or the network, and therefore you don't need them. But that's the way you import a driver in Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and Workbench. When that is done, you need to modify this, because you need to force it to install all the drivers. And you do that in pre-install. It has a step called inject drivers, and it says all drivers, install only matching drivers from the selection profile. Matching profiles, matching drivers, that's plug and play. Since we create the reference image on a virtual machine, it's going to install nothing. So we need to change this. And there's two ways of doing this. The easiest way is to actually create something called a selection profile. Windows to Go drivers. And then I select all my Windows to Go drivers. Go back to my sequence, open it up again, go to pre-install, inject drivers, and I say install everything from that profile. That means that all those drivers will be injected into the driver store. If they are in the driver store, a user can then use those drivers. So you should also be smart. If you know that your users will attend locations that has printers that may not exist by default in Windows, you also need to add printer devices. If you know that your users are going to use my Wi-Fi sticks, USB devices, things, USB card readers, things like that, because that is something that you use in your company, you need to shoot those drivers into graphic, network, storage, and all the devices that people are using around the globe. They need to be there too. So when that is done, we are done with the sequence, and we create a boot image, and we boot up the image, and we wait until Windows has been installed, which is kind of boring to look at. So we're not going to do that. If you haven't seen Windows installed, it's not even fun. I missed something. Basic applications. You also need to have applications in here. So what kind of applications should you put in your Windows to Go device? I suggest you strongly consider to start using AppV. AppV makes sense together with Windows to Go. That way, you can centrally manage the application. So the user fires it up, and then he starts to AppV application. If it's updated or modified, it's going to be downloaded from the server. So he has the latest and the greatest version. Remember that those USB devices may be in use only once a week, or once a month, or maybe only once in a lifetime, depending on what is the purpose of the USB stick. And then it's nice to have some kind of working application, right? So AppV makes sense when you do this. That means the AppV agent, the AppV framework should be in here. There are a bunch of settings, I will cover that in a few minutes, that is automatically created for this. Now, then we have this little issue. This is a Windows to Go USB device. It's not that big. It's not a USB stick. This is a USB disk. This is an SSD drive inside a USB device. And that is the number one most important thing. It doesn't matter what kind of USB stick you have, it's never going to work because you need two partitions. And you cannot, in Windows, create two partitions on a USB stick, on a thumb drive. You need to have a disk to make two partitions. We need two partitions because one of them is a 350 megabyte size partition that runs FAT32. And that scares many people away. It's like, what? Why do we need a FAT32 for? Well, you do. You do that because this device supports UEFI 32 in UEFI 64 and a normal BIOS too. And for the UEFI part to work, we need to have FAT32 because that's the only way we can boot a UEFI device. It doesn't need to have USB 3, but if you don't have it, it's awfully slow. For a USB device like this, you really need to have that. And you need to make sure that the BIOS supports booting on the USB device. It might seem obvious that it should boot on a USB device. Try to find a Slate device and try to figure out where on the screen you should push to make it boot from a USB device without the keyboard. Not that easy. Trust me. I tried. A keyboard fixed the problem. So there are only a few certified drives today, and if you are going for this, I recommend that you really pay the extra money to get the certified devices because they are ugly fast and they work. There are a bunch of clones, which is of course is cheaper. I tried a couple of them, and they have a performance that is scary. So don't do that. Not going to flip over there. Let's flip over here and see how it works. So to be able to create all this, it's possible to do in two ways. You can either do the bulk configuration, bulk generation of everything, but I don't believe in that, so I use another creation tool instead. I'm just going to find my computer, which is somewhere around here. Yep, there you go. And let me walk through a couple of things. Number one is that you need to have a special unattended XML file. And what's special about this? Move word wrap and switch the font to, you should be able to see that. What does it do? Well, one thing that is kind of obvious, it's disabling the Windows recovery environment. Doesn't really make any sense to have that, so that's gone away. It also has another policy file, which is called a SAN policy file. And this switches the SAN policy to 4. Thank you, then I know. Perfect. Should be a 4. Number 4 means when you boot on a USB Windows to Go device, all local fixed drives will be offline. That means if I take the stick and put it in your computer, I cannot see your drive. And that is a security boundary. I shouldn't be able to access your drive. I'm just using your machine. And it's the opposite around too. If I put in my USB device in your computer, it's offline. A Windows to Go stick is always offline when you put it in a computer, and the local drives are always offline. That can be changed as long as you are the local administrator of that Windows to Go device. But an end user is not, and he's not supposed to access it. It can be changed, it's fine, but you should consider the small risk of having infected documents moved over from the local user's drive or from a computer in a hotel or something like that. So we need those 2 files, and we need something more. This is the PowerShell script that I'm basically is using to do this. This PowerShell script creates the unattended XML file. It also creates the SAN policy XML file. And when that is done, it's trying to find a USB stick that is larger than 20 gigs. It's going to clear the disk. Okay? So where do I run this? Do I run it on the end user's computer or something like that? No. I have a creation machine back in my office. This is my image machine. This is where I create reference images, and I also create my Windows to Go devices. So it's like a copying machine. It's going to format and partition the drive, and as you can see, it's doing MBR, and the partition size is 350, and we have the file system of FAT32. And then it creates the operating system partition, which is going to be based on NTFS. Creates 2 drive letters, and we need to have those drive letters so that we can mount the WIM file and inject the Active Directory blob. So we figure out where all these things are, and then we apply, using a dism command, we apply the SAN policy file. It needs to be applied this way, because it cannot be in the unattended XML file. Then it doesn't work. Then we shoot in the unattended XML file to the right location. And in this case, it creates a random name. You don't need to have the random name. You can also specify the name by using a variable in the top of the file. And then we use djoin and to get the information from Active Directory. We get the blob, and we shoot in the blob into the image, and then we are done. We also modify some HKLM parameters to that machine before we fire it up. When everything is done, you have a USB device. In my computer, I do have a USB device. And my goal is to create a new machine. Which is going to be in this location. D:\VMs. Give it a bunch of, and let's connect that to my internal headquarter network. And I'm not going to attach a hard drive at all. So this is a blank virtual machine. Has never been started. I go into settings, and I go to my IDE controller. As you can see, I can select my Windows to Go device since it's offline. So this is a marvelous way of testing and verifying your Windows to Go devices without actually having a bunch of computers. You can do it virtualized. So this has not been started on this machine ever. It is my personal Windows to Go device, so this is what I use to access my backyard home. And you see it's doing the getting devices ready. It's another thing that I have noticed is, everybody thinks that running on a USB device should be slow. These USB devices are extremely fast, so if I compare it to running on a native VHDX file on an SSD drive, it's pretty much the same performance. That's the time it takes to power it up on a new machine that it hasn't been powered up, so it has created a new profile and all that thing. Sometimes after you have logged on and everything is fine, it will detect new drivers, as I told you. Some of these drivers will require a reboot. You can't do anything about it. The end user will be notified that there are pending reboots and things like that. There are a couple of things that doesn't work correctly. That is disabled. For instance, the Microsoft Store is obviously disabled by default, and you cannot you cannot sleep a Windows to Go device either. I mean, there are some obvious things that doesn't work in the Windows to Go environment. If I go like that, it's going to be really angry because it doesn't have internet access. But you can see it's trying to get back to my network. But since this machine was activated the last time, it's going to be fine. So it's going to work pretty much the same way as it should be. So what happens if I jank out the USB device? Now in this case, it's emulated and simulated, so it's going to break. But if I did it on a physical machine, but I just refuse to reboot my physical machine, you have 60 seconds to put the USB device back in the same USB plug. Not another one, the same. Okay, 60 seconds. Then the machine dies. That is one of the funniest things you can do. To steal the USB device and then run away and say, haha, catch me if you can. When you tell that to your kids back home, they're going to start doing that game with you, and you're going to have so funny chasing them down before the machine breaks down. 60 seconds to find a kid and the USB device and then plug it back again. Other than that, it works pretty well. It's pretty stable. So we have only the ordinary problems that we have with the networking, drivers, and direct access on strange networks. So if I shut this down, you can see it's pretty fast. If I start it up again, it's going to be slightly faster because now the machine has already done the plug-and-play part. And you can see that from power on to, it's already connected. It just takes a couple of seconds to boot the machine up, and this is a virtual Windows to Go device. So, besides those small things, Active Directory, KMS, direct access, all that stuff. The only issues we have is user education. We had users that has a hard time finding out how to boot on the USB device. It is possible to configure a machine to do the next boot, but that is only going to be their own personal device. They cannot do that on a new device. So it's really going to be people that knows how to modify a BIOS on a laptop or a machine somewhere around the globe to boot on the USB device. Other than that, we don't have any issues. We have, I should say this. I'm sorry, we do have. We don't have any issues in the Active Directory policies. What we have is the how do we recognize all these machines. So we have one customer that had a scheduled task that deleted machines that hadn't been active for 60 days. About half of all the Windows to Go devices went away, so they couldn't boot up again. So that's the kind of issues we had so far. Besides, they need to connect to the network. With that, my gentlemen, questions? No questions? How many of you are going to try Windows to Go when you get back home? A couple of you. Have you found a scenario when you think it will work? You have a scenario where you think it will work? Yep. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So I'm going to repeat that because contractors is something that was the first thing I actually was hit by. A company gave me a computer and said, this is the computer you're supposed to use when you connect to our network. And I said, okay, that's fine. And then I worked for another company and they also gave me a computer. And I was like, if I have 10 customers, I need 10 laptops. I need a trolley to put them on. That's just ridiculous. So that is a scenario that actually works. Anyway, if you do have any questions, please feel free to come up. Otherwise, have a nice afternoon. Thank you for stopping by. And please fill out the